They laughed when I inherited 80 acres of worthless rock. A week later, those same men were lined up at my door, and my dog was the only thing standing between us. The day my grandfather's will was read, the whole town of Silver Creek thought they understood what he'd left me. Black Elk Ridge, wind, stone, nothing else. But my grandfather had never been a man who wasted words or land. What they didn't see that day was what lay beneath the surface. And what they didn't expect was that I'd be ready to protect it. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city and state in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The old wooden church at Silver Creek had not changed in 50 years. The pine boards still creaked under heavy boots. The stained glass windows still bent the afternoon light into faded blues and reds across the floor. Dust drifted in the beams of sunlight like slow-falling ash. Ethan Brooks stood near the back wall, hands folded in front of him, shoulders squared out of habit more than pride. He wore a simple dark jacket, pressed jeans, and boots that had seen more mountain trails than town sidewalks. His face carried the quiet stiffness of a man who had learned to measure every room before entering it. Beside the doorway, tied loosely to the iron hitching ring outside, Shadow waited. The German shepherd stood alert, ears forward, amber eyes scanning every passerby. Well, he did not whine. He did not shift. He watched. Inside, most of the town had gathered. Ranchers in felt hats, the mayor, a representative from Western Frontier Energy who had shown up out of respect, old neighbors who had known Walter Brooks since he first bought land on the northern ridge. Walter Brooks had been many things: Korean War veteran, rancher, quiet man of stubborn principles. But foolish was never one of them, at least not in Ethan's memory. The lawyer, Mr. Harlan Pierce, adjusted his glasses and unfolded the final page of the will. The primary residence on Main Street shall be divided between the grandchildren as previously agreed, he read in a careful, practiced tone. The lower pasture and grazing rights shall transfer to the Holloway family under existing lease terms. Murmurs of approval rippled through the pews. Frank Holloway leaned back, satisfied. Ethan said nothing. He had not expected much. Pierce cleared his throat and continued. To my grandson, Ethan Brooks, United States Army, I leave the full title and mineral rights to the northern tract of land known locally as Black Elk Ridge, totaling approximately 80 acres. There was a pause. Then someone laughed. It wasn't loud at first. Just a sharp exhale from the second row. Then another. A low chuckle rolled from the back. Within seconds, the room filled with the kind of laughter men make when something confirms what they already believe. Black Elk Ridge. Not everyone in Silver Creek knew that land. Dry wind, broken shale, no grazing value, no timber worth hauling. A rocky spine that cut against the sky like the back of some ancient animal long turned to stone. Walter always did have a sense of humor, someone muttered. Frank Holloway didn't bother lowering his voice. Guess the boy got himself a whole lot of wind and rattlesnakes. The laughter rose again, easy and comfortable. Yet Ethan felt it in his chest, the way he used to feel the low thud of distant artillery. Pressure without sound, something heavy pressing inward. His jaw tightened, his breathing slowed, deliberate. He did not look at them. He stared at the warped wooden floorboards beneath his boots. Pierce continued reading the legal phrasing, but most of the room had already moved on. The important land had been distributed, the productive acres secured. Black Elk Ridge was an afterthought. Outside, Shadow shifted. Through the open doorway, Ethan could see the dog's silhouette framed against the pale Montana sky. Shadow's ears twitched at the rise in voices. He sensed the change in the air long before words carried meaning. When the reading ended, chairs scraped back. Conversations began before condolences had properly finished. Frank Holloway approached first. Ethan, he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Looks like your granddad left you a mountain. Ethan met his gaze calmly. Looks that way. Can't graze it, can't farm it. But hey, maybe you can build yourself a cabin up there and talk to the wind. Another laugh. A few others joined in. The mayor clapped Ethan lightly on the shoulder. Walter meant well. Sentimental, that's all. Sentimental. Ethan nodded once. He stepped outside without another word. The mountain air felt colder than it had an hour ago, and Shadow immediately moved to his side, pressing close to his leg, tail low but steady. Ethan reached down and unclipped the leash. Shadow did not run. He stood facing the church doors, watching the men who had laughed. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck, fingers threading into thick fur. The steady warmth grounded him. In the distance, black Elk Ridge rose against the western sky. The ridge caught the light differently than the surrounding land, and its jagged spine cut through the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows down the valley. Walter Brooks had taken Ethan up there when he was 12. "Don't ever judge land by what it shows you first," his grandfather had said, tapping the ground with the heel of his boot. "Most men see the surface. The smart ones learn to ask what's underneath." Ethan swallowed slowly. Behind him, the church doors opened, and more laughter spilled out, fading into the breeze. Shadow's ears flicked toward the sound, but he did not move. Ethan looked at the ridge again, really looked at it. The uneven slope, the pale stone exposed like bone beneath thin soil, the way the wind cut along its face in steady, invisible lines. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice carried on that wind. "That ridge isn't empty," Ethan said quietly. Shadow turned his head toward him. Ethan's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something steadier. "It's waiting." The laughter drifted behind him, loose and careless, as he and his dog walked toward the truck. Neither of them looked back. That night, the wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains hard and steady, rattling the loose tin along the side of Ethan's cabin. The place sat just outside Silver Creek, tucked against a line of fir trees that broke the worst of the winter storms. It wasn't much. One bedroom, wood stove, a porch that sagged slightly on the left, but it was quiet. But most nights, quiet was enough. Shadow lay near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes half open as always. Even in sleep, he listened. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, staring into the dark beyond the window. Black Elk Ridge was barely visible in the distance, its shape blending into the night sky. He could still hear the laughter in his head. Not the words, just the sound. Casual. Certain. He turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway. But the first bang came just as he reached the bedroom. A loose shutter slammed against the siding in the wind. His body reacted before his mind did. He dropped low, breath sharp in his chest, heart hammering against his ribs. The dark hallway blurred into a different dark. The desert outside Kandahar. A doorway kicked open, a flash of light that never left his memory. Another bang. His pulse spiked. Shadow was already there. The dog moved fast but silent, pressing his body against Ethan's side, leaning his weight into him. A low, steady whine vibrated from his chest. Not fear, but grounding. Shadow nudged Ethan's hand with his muzzle, firm and deliberate. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. "Not there," he muttered under his breath. "You're home." The third bang came softer this time as the wind shifted. Just the shutter, just Montana wind. Shadow placed his chin against Ethan's knee and stayed. The dog had learned his job long ago, not just to track explosives or clear rooms, but to bring Ethan back when his mind drifted too far. Slowly, the cabin came back into focus. The smell of pine smoke from the stove. The hum of the refrigerator. The distant howl of wind through the trees. Ethan sank down against the wall and let his breathing settle. After a while, he pushed himself up and walked to the living room. The wooden chest sat against the far wall beneath an old photograph of Walter Brooks in uniform. Korean War, young, unsmiling, strong jaw and steady eyes. Ethan knelt beside the chest and lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of worn notebooks, rolled maps bound with twine, and a metal tube containing official documents. Walter's handwriting covered the covers in neat, tight script. Shadow moved closer, sniffing lightly before settling beside him. Ethan untied the first bundle. A topographical map of Black Elk Ridge unfolded across the coffee table. The lines were detailed, precise, marked with measurements and notations in the margins. Depth indicators, soil composition references, small X's drawn in deliberate ink. This wasn't sentimental land. This was studied land. Ethan opened one of the notebooks. Lithium-bearing pegmatite formations observed beneath northern slope, Walter had written decades ago. Unverified by formal survey. Potential significant value pending future battery tech expansion. Ethan's fingers stilled. Lithium. He wasn't a geologist, but he wasn't ignorant either. He'd seen enough news about electric vehicles and battery plants moving west. Companies buying up mineral rights across Nevada and Colorado. He flipped the page. Subsurface water flow confirmed. Spring basin beneath western shelf. Untapped. Stable. There were dates beside each entry. Measurements. Depth estimates. Even cross-sections drawn by hand. Walter hadn't left him 80 acres of useless rock. He had left him information, while Shadow shifted closer and rested his head on Ethan's thigh. Ethan looked down at the dog and let out a slow breath. "You knew something, didn't you?" he said softly, though he knew the question wasn't meant for the dog. He stood and walked to the window. The ridge lay dark and quiet beneath the moonlight. Most men in town saw wind and stone. Walter had seen what lay underneath. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, not anger, not pride, recognition. And he had followed Walter up that ridge when he was 12, carried tools, held stakes while his grandfather measured slope angles and soil density. "Men rush to grab what's easy," Walter had said once, tapping his boot against exposed rock. "The smart ones wait." Ethan rested his forehead lightly against the cool glass. Outside, the wind eased. Behind him, Shadow rose slowly and padded toward the door. He sat facing it, ears lifted, posture alert, but calm. Guarding. Ethan turned back to the table and gathered the maps again. The laughter from earlier felt different now, smaller. He sat down and began studying the markings more closely. One X in particular caught his eye, near the western edge where the slope narrowed into a natural corridor. There were measurements written beside it. Width, grade percentage, a pass. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Well, Western Frontier Energy had been trying for years to secure a stable route for pipeline expansion through this region. Everyone in town knew that. They'd surveyed the southern properties. The terrain was unstable, too steep. He looked at the ridge again in his mind. Black Elk Ridge cut through the valley at a lower grade. His grandfather hadn't just studied minerals. He had mapped access. Shadow let out a low rumble, not a growl, but a warning sound deep in his chest. Ethan looked toward the door. Nothing moved outside, just wind in the trees. But the dog's posture had changed. Still, focused. Ethan rose slowly and stepped onto the porch. The night air bit cold against his skin. The stars hung clear and sharp overhead. In the distance, faint headlights moved along the road toward town. Nothing unusual. Still, Shadow remained alert until the lights disappeared. Ethan crouched beside him. "We're not done," he said quietly. And the dog's tail thumped once against the wooden boards. Inside the cabin, the maps lay spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle no one else in Silver Creek had bothered to see. Ethan closed the door behind them and locked it. Sleep did not come easily that night. But when it did, it came with purpose. Ethan woke before dawn, long before the sun crested the bitter roots. The cabin was still dark, the air sharp with early morning cold. For a moment he lay still, listening. No banging shutters, no phantom echoes of distant explosions, just the steady breathing of Shadow at the foot of the bed. The dog lifted his head the second Ethan moved. "You ready?" Ethan asked quietly. Shadow stood, stretched once and was already alert. By the time the first pale line of light touched the eastern sky, Ethan's truck was climbing the narrow dirt road that wound toward Black Elk Ridge. The tires crunched over gravel and loose shale. Pine trees thinned as elevation rose, giving way to exposed rock and stubborn patches of grass that clung to life in cracks between stone. The ridge looked different in daylight, harsh, open, unforgiving. Wind cut across the slope in long, steady currents. It carried the smell of dry earth and distant snowmelt from higher peaks. Ethan parked near the base and stepped out. Shadow jumped down beside him, immediately scanning the horizon. They began the climb. Loose stones shifted beneath their boots and paws. The incline wasn't brutal, but it demanded attention. Ethan followed the path his grandfather had once shown him, a natural contour that cut diagonally across the slope, less steep than it first appeared. Halfway up, he paused and looked out across the valley. Silver Creek lay small and quiet below, a scattering of rooftops and barns stitched together by a thin ribbon of highway. From this height, the town's certainty seemed fragile. 80 acres of wind, Frank Holloway had called it. Ethan turned back toward the ridge. At the western edge, the terrain narrowed. The jagged rise softened into a natural corridor, subtle, almost hidden unless you knew how to read the land. He pulled the folded map from his jacket and compared it to the view in front of him. The measurements matched. Width, 22 feet at its tightest point. Grade, less than 3%. A pass. Shadow moved ahead, nose low, weaving between stones. He stopped abruptly, near a cluster of pale rock jutting from the earth. His ears flicked. He began to dig. "Easy," Ethan called, but the dog was focused. Within seconds, loose gravel scattered aside. Beneath it, the color changed. Not the dull gray of surface shale, but a lighter streak threaded with faint metallic shimmer. Ethan crouched down. He brushed away more debris with his gloved hand. The exposed rock beneath was denser, smoother. When he tapped it lightly with a small hammer he'd brought along. The sound was different. Solid. Resonant. Shadow shifted position suddenly, body tensing. A section of loose shale above them gave way with a sharp crack. "Move!" Ethan barked. Shadow lunged toward him just as several rocks slid down the slope. Ethan stumbled back, boots scrambling for grip. One stone struck his shoulder hard enough to knock him sideways. Shadow positioned himself uphill, bracing, as smaller fragments bounced around them. The slide lasted only seconds, but it felt longer. When the slope settled, silence returned except for the wind. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You all right?" he asked. Shadow stood steady but lifted one paw briefly before setting it down again. Ethan checked him carefully. A shallow scrape along the dog's foreleg, nothing deep, just blood at the surface. "You always take the hit first," Ethan muttered. Yet he tore a strip from a clean cloth in his pack and wrapped the minor cut securely. Shadow didn't resist. He never did. Ethan turned back to the exposed rock. The small slide had uncovered more of it. A vein ran through the stone, thin but consistent. He compared it to the notes in Walter's journal. Lithium-bearing pegmatite formations observed beneath northern slope. He wasn't a mining engineer, but he understood enough to know this wasn't random. He moved farther along the corridor, checking slope and stability. The ground underfoot here was different from the fractured shale lower down. Firmer, compacted. He crouched again and pressed his palm flat against the earth. It felt cooler than it should have under the rising sun. He frowned. Walter's notes mentioned subsurface water flow beneath the western shelf. Ethan stood and walked toward a shallow depression near the rock wall. Shadow followed, limping only slightly. The depression didn't look like much. Just uneven ground between stone outcroppings. Ethan knelt and drove a metal rod from his pack into the soil. It met resistance after a short depth. He pulled it out and examined the tip. Damp. He pushed again a few feet over. Same result. Water. Not surface runoff. Not seasonal melt. Something steady beneath. He sat back on his heels, wind pulling at his jacket. From below, the ridge appeared barren. Up here, it felt different. Alive with what it hid. Shadow moved to stand beside him, gaze fixed down the slope toward town. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight. A vehicle crawled along the dirt road far below. Not a ranch truck. Too clean. Too deliberate. It paused near the lower boundary of Black Elk Ridge before continuing on. Ethan's jaw tightened. Western Frontier Energy had been surveying for years. If they'd overlooked this ridge before, they wouldn't for long. He packed up slowly, memorizing the contours of the land as he descended. Every dip, every rise, every angle of sun against stone. This wasn't just mineral value. It was access. The pass cut through terrain that had frustrated engineers for decades. He reached the truck just as the sun climbed fully above the peaks. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, though he favored his wrapped leg slightly. Ethan rested his hands on the steering wheel but didn't start the engine. The laughter in the church echoed faintly in memory. 80 acres of wind. He looked up at the ridge one last time. They hadn't laughed because they were cruel. They'd laughed because they thought they understood. He started the truck. As they drove back toward town, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not even vindication. Strategy. Black Elk Ridge wasn't empty. It was leverage. And for the first time since the reading of the will, Ethan understood why his grandfather had chosen him. Shadow rested his head against the door, eyes open, watching the road ahead. They were no longer just defending land. They were guarding something far more valuable. And someone, somewhere in Silver Creek, was beginning to realize it. It didn't take long. 3 days later, a black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel drive toward Ethan's cabin. It was too clean for ranch work and too polished for hunting season. The tires stopped short of the porch, engine idling for a moment, before cutting off. Shadow was on his feet before the driver's door opened. Ethan had been stacking firewood along the side of the cabin. He straightened slowly, wiped his hands on his jeans, and turned. Frank Holloway stepped out first. Broad shoulders, expensive boots, the same confident half-smile he'd worn inside the wooden church. From the passenger side emerged Mayor Dalton Pierce, adjusting his coat against the wind. And from the back seat, a third man Ethan didn't recognize. Mid-40s, pressed coat, clean haircut, city posture. He carried a leather portfolio tucked neatly beneath his arm. Shadow moved forward until he stood squarely between Ethan and the three men. His ears rose, body rigid, but silent. "Afternoon, Ethan," Frank called casually, as if they'd come to borrow a cup of sugar. Ethan nodded once. "Frank." The wind tugged at everyone's jackets. It carried the faint scent of coming snow. We thought we'd stop by," the mayor said, stepping carefully around loose gravel. "Talk neighbor to neighbor." Shadow let out a low rumble. The third man cleared his throat politely. "Daniel Reeves," he said, extending a hand. "Western Frontier Energy." Ethan did not take it. Reeves lowered his hand smoothly, unoffended. "Mind if we talk inside?" Frank asked. Ethan glanced at Shadow. The dog didn't move. "We can talk here," Ethan replied. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt different from the laughter in the church. Heavier, measured. Frank removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Look," he began. "We all know that Ridge ain't exactly prime cattle country. You're a smart man, Ethan. You've seen enough to know that." Ethan said nothing. Reeves stepped forward slightly. "Our company has been surveying this region for infrastructure expansion, pipeline routing, future energy projects. But we believe Black Elk Ridge may offer certain logistical advantages." The word advantages hung carefully between them. "And?" Ethan asked. Reeves offered a thin smile. "We're prepared to make a generous offer for full purchase of the property, mineral rights included." Frank nodded. "Cash, clean deal, no headaches." Shadow shifted his weight, eyes never leaving the men. "How generous?" Ethan asked evenly. Reeves opened the portfolio and produced a document. He didn't hand it over, but he held it so Ethan could see the number printed clearly at the bottom. It was more money than most men in Silver Creek would see in 10 years. Frank watched Ethan's face closely, expecting surprise. Ethan's expression did not change. "That's your opening?" he asked quietly. Reeves blinked once. "It's more than fair," the mayor said quickly. "The land's been sitting there doing nothing." Ethan stepped forward just enough that Shadow adjusted position, and still guarding the space between them. "Nothing," Ethan repeated. Frank's smile tightened. "We're not here to argue," he said. "We're here to help you make a smart decision." "And if I don't?" The wind picked up, tugging at coats and carrying fine dust across the yard. Reeves's tone remained smooth. "We're confident this project will move forward, one way or another." Shadow's rumble deepened. Ethan met Reeves's eyes. "You think you're the first ones to look at that ridge?" Ethan asked. Frank shifted slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Ethan said calmly, "that my grandfather studied that land longer than any survey team you've sent up there." The mayor frowned. "Walter was a rancher. He was Army Corps of Engineers before that." Reeves's expression flickered, just briefly. "You've been up there," he said quietly. "Yes. And you found something." Ethan did not answer. The silence stretched thin. Frank exhaled sharply. "Don't get stubborn on us." "Oh, Ethan, you got handed a pile of rocks. Now you're being offered a clean way out." Shadow took one deliberate step forward. Reeves glanced at the dog. "You might consider restraining him." "He's restrained," Ethan said evenly. "He's just paying attention." The wind died down slightly, leaving the air unnervingly still. Reeves closed the portfolio. "We're not asking twice," he said. There it was. Not shouted, not aggressive, but clear. The mayor looked uncomfortable now. Frank did not. Yet Ethan studied each of them in turn. In Afghanistan, he had learned that threats rarely arrived loud. They arrived polite, calculated, certain. "I'm not selling," Ethan said. Frank's jaw tightened. "Everyone sells," he replied. Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not this." Reeves tilted his head. "Then what exactly do you plan to do with it?" Ethan's gaze drifted past them toward the distant line of Black Elk Ridge cutting across the horizon. "I plan to wait." Frank let out a short laugh, but it lacked the easy confidence of the church. "You don't have the leverage you think you do." Ethan looked back at him. "Maybe." The wind returned, colder this time. Reeves slipped the document back into his portfolio. "We'll be in touch," he said carefully. Frank replaced his hat. The mayor avoided eye contact. They walked back to the SUV without another word. Shadow did not relax until the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road. Only then did he step back toward Ethan's side. Ethan crouched and ran a hand along the dog's neck. "You felt that too," he murmured. Shadow leaned into his touch. The offer had not been about money. It had been about access. And they were nervous. Ethan stood and looked toward town. They would not stop with one visit. That much was certain. Inside the cabin, the map still lay spread across the table. Outside, black Elk Ridge stood silent against the sky. For the first time since the will was read, the laughter felt distant, but replaced by something else. Pressure, and the unmistakable sense that the next move would not be polite. It came 5 nights later. The temperature had dropped below freezing. A thin crust of snow covered the yard, reflecting moonlight in pale blue sheets. The world outside the cabin looked quiet, almost peaceful. Ethan had just banked the stove and turned off the lamp when Shadow's head snapped up. No growl at first, just stillness. The kind that meant he heard something Ethan couldn't. "What is it?" Ethan asked softly. Shadow was already moving toward the door, muscles tight, tail low and rigid. Ethan felt it then, a subtle vibration beneath the silence. Not wind, not wildlife. Footsteps. Slow, careful. Crunching faintly over frozen ground. Ethan's pulse changed instantly. Not panic, not yet. Just awareness. He stepped quietly to the window and lifted the corner of the curtain a fraction. A shape moved near the tree line, another near the lower fence. Well, they weren't ranchers. They weren't lost hunters. They were watching the cabin. Shadow let out a low, controlled growl. Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Stay." The word barely left his lips before a sharp, metallic snap echoed outside. A gate latch. Shadow's restraint lasted half a second. He bolted. The door burst open as Ethan reached for him. "Shadow!" The dog was already across the yard, a dark blur against the snow. A man near the fence cursed and stumbled backward. "Hey!" A flashlight beam jerked wildly across the trees. Shadow launched forward with full force, barking now, deep, commanding, trained. One of the men swung something metal toward him. There was a sudden, explosive crack in the air. Not thunder, not a car backfire. A gunshot. The sound tore through the valley and through Ethan's chest at the same time. Shadow yelped. It wasn't a long cry, it was sharp and cut short. Ethan was already running. "Shadow!" The men scattered instantly, crashing through brush toward the tree line. Another flashlight dropped and rolled across the snow before snapping off. Ethan reached Shadow near the fence. The dog was standing, but barely. Blood darkened the white snow beneath his shoulder. Ethan dropped to his knees. "Easy, easy, buddy." Shadow's breathing was fast but controlled. His eyes locked onto Ethan's face, steady despite the pain. "You're okay," Ethan said, though his voice shook. "You're okay." He pressed his gloved hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. The bullet hadn't passed through. It had grazed along the shoulder, tearing muscle but missing bone. Luck, or inches. The cold air burned in Ethan's lungs as he lifted the dog carefully into his arms. Shadow did not whimper. He kept his head upright, scanning the dark even as Ethan carried him toward the truck. The engine roared to life, tires spinning briefly before gripping the icy road. Silver Creek's only veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, lights dark at this hour. Ethan didn't slow down. He pulled up hard and carried Shadow to the door, pounding with his fist. "Dr. Lawson," he shouted, "open up!" The minutes felt endless. Finally, a light flicked on inside. The door opened. Dr. Hannah Lawson, gray hair pulled back loosely, took one look at the blood and stepped aside without question. "Bring him in." The exam room smelled of antiseptic and warm air. Ethan stood back as Dr. Lawson worked quickly, hands steady and experienced. "It's a grazing wound," she said after several tense minutes. "Close call. But it didn't hit bone. Didn't hit lung." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "He'll need stitches, antibiotics, rest." Shadow lay on the table, eyes still alert, refusing to fully relax until Ethan stepped closer and placed a hand on his head. The dog's tail thumped weakly once. "You protected him, Doctor," Lawson said quietly. Ethan swallowed. He was doing his job. And so were you. Ethan looked down at Shadow's bandaged shoulder. The laughter in the church had been harmless. The visit from Frank had been a warning. This was escalation. Someone had crossed a line. By the time Ethan carried Shadow back into the cabin, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten again. He laid the dog carefully near the stove and built the fire up higher. Snow still covered the yard outside, when footprints cut through it near the fence, leading toward the woods. Ethan stepped onto the porch, staring at them. They hadn't come to talk. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to intimidate. And they had fired at his dog. He crouched and brushed a hand lightly over one of the tracks. Heavy boots. At least 2 men. Professional enough to move quietly. Sloppy enough to panic when challenged. Ethan stood slowly. Inside, Shadow shifted but did not attempt to rise. "Oh, you rest," Ethan said softly. The dog's eyes followed him anyway. Ethan moved to the table where Walter's maps still lay open. The ridge, the pass, the lithium, the water. It was no longer theoretical leverage. It was worth risking a crime under the cover of darkness. He stared at the western corridor marked on the map. "They're afraid," he murmured. Shadow's ears twitched at the tone in his voice. Ethan looked toward the window, where the first light of dawn touched the distant outline of Black Elk Ridge. The laughter had faded. The offers had shifted. Now there was something else in Silver Creek. Desperation. And Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer about selling land. It was about who controlled what lay beneath it. He stepped back to Shadow's side and knelt. "I won't let them take it," he said quietly. Shadow's eyes never left his. Outside, the morning sun rose over the ridge, turning the stone face gold, and for the first time, Ethan understood the cost of waiting. It was going to test more than his patience. It was going to test his resolve. By mid-morning, Silver Creek had already heard about the gunshot. News traveled faster than snowmelt in a small town. A ranch hand claimed he'd seen headlights near Ethan's place. Someone else swore they heard a shot echo off the ridge just before dawn. Which by the time Ethan walked into the general store to pick up fresh bandages and antibiotics, the conversations stopped mid-sentence. Frank Holloway stood near the coffee machine. "So I hear your dog tangled with a coyote," he said casually. Ethan looked at him. It wasn't a coyote. Frank's smile held, but his eyes didn't. "Mountain lion's been coming down lately," the mayor added from behind the counter. "Hungry this time of year." Shadow wasn't with Ethan. He was resting at home under Dr. Lawson's instructions. The absence felt heavier than usual. Ethan stepped closer to Frank. "There were boot prints," he said quietly. 2 sets, maybe 3. Frank shrugged. "People walk around in boots out here." Ethan held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned away. He didn't need their denial. He needed protection. That afternoon, he drove to Helena. The city felt foreign after years of quiet valley roads, traffic lights, brick buildings, and lawyers' names etched in polished brass outside office doors. Claire Donovan's office sat on the second floor of a modest building overlooking Last Chance Gulch. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, composed. Her handshake was firm and direct. "You're Walter Brooks's grandson," she said, after hearing his name. "I met your grandfather once at a land rights seminar. He asked better questions than anyone in the room." Ethan nodded. "He left me something," he said, laying the maps and notebooks across her desk. "And now people are trying to scare me into selling it." Claire studied the documents in silence for several long minutes. "These mineral notations are precise," she said finally. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was marking. He was Army Corps of Engineers. I know. She looked up. And you've confirmed the formations? Yes. And the corridor? Yes. Claire leaned back in her chair. That ridge isn't useless, she said. It's strategic. Ethan felt a flicker of relief. So what do I do? You don't sell, she replied immediately. He watched her carefully. You lease. She turned one of the maps toward him and tapped the western pass. This corridor is the only stable route through that part of the valley. Western Frontier Energy knows that. They can't tunnel economically, and they can't reroute south without adding millions in grading costs. She slid a legal pad toward him. You offer them a limited easement, 30 years, renewable, annual payments indexed to throughput. And the minerals? You retain majority ownership. They extract under strict royalty agreements. Ethan felt something settle into place. And the water? He asked. Claire smiled slightly. That's your leverage. He exhaled slowly. They fired at my dog. Claire's expression hardened. Then they're nervous. She stood and walked to the window. All companies don't escalate unless they're afraid of losing control. If they wanted to bully you legally, they would have filed papers already. So they're trying to intimidate me? Yes. She turned back toward him. Which means you're holding more than they expected. Ethan thought of Shadow standing between him and the men at the door. Thought of the dog launching forward without hesitation. I'm not selling, he said. Claire nodded. Good. They spent the next 3 hours drafting initial protections, property surveillance filings, formal notice of trespass, a letter to Western Frontier Energy, requesting all future communication go through legal counsel. By the time Ethan drove back toward Silver Creek, the sun had dipped low over the mountains. The valley looked peaceful from a distance. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. When he stepped inside the cabin, Shadow lifted his head weakly, but wagged his tail once. Hey, soldier, Ethan murmured, kneeling beside him. The bandage was clean, the dog's breathing steady. Ethan sat down on the floor and leaned back against the couch. I'm not selling, he said quietly. Shadow blinked, eyes steady. Outside, a truck slowed briefly on the road before continuing on. Ethan listened carefully. No footsteps. No snapping branches. Just wind again. But the tension hadn't left. It had simply shifted. He rose and walked to the window, but a black Elk Ridge stood silhouetted against the fading sky. They think I'll break, he said softly. Shadow shifted, trying to stand. Easy, Ethan told him. The dog lay back down but kept watching the door. Ethan turned from the window and looked at Walter's photograph on the wall. You didn't leave me land, he said under his breath. You left me a test. He walked back to the table and unfolded the map once more. This time, he didn't study it as a grandson. Just he studied it as a man preparing for a campaign. Every line, every mark, every elevation note. He reached for his phone and typed a single message to Claire. I'm ready. Across town, lights flickered on one by one as evening settled over Silver Creek. Inside the cabin, Ethan sat beside his injured dog and listened to the quiet. The next move wouldn't be loud. It would be legal, and far more dangerous. The first official letter arrived 3 days later, but Western Frontier Energy's logo was embossed across the top in confident blue ink. The language was polite, measured, and carefully neutral. They requested cooperative discussions regarding infrastructure access across Black Elk Ridge. They emphasized mutual benefit and regional economic growth. They never mentioned the night shots. Claire called that afternoon. They're testing the perimeter, she said, seeing how firm you are. I'm firm, Ethan replied. I know, but they'll escalate in paperwork now. environmental impact assessments, access studies, maybe even attempts at eminent domain pressure if they think they can push it. Ethan stood at the kitchen window while she spoke. Outside, fresh snow dusted the yard again. Shadow lay near the stove, shoulder healing, but movement still slow. They won't win that, Claire added. Not with your grandfather's filings. Well, the mineral rights and water basin documentation give you leverage. Ethan rubbed his forehead slowly. The sound of drilling from a survey crew working on the southern slope had started 2 days ago. It was faint from this distance, but on certain wind shifts it carried clearly. The low mechanical whine pierced through the quiet valley, and each time it did, something inside him tightened. The first time it happened at night, he woke sitting upright in bed, breath shallow, had hands clenched so tight his knuckles burned. Shadow was already there. The dog pushed his body against Ethan's side, forcing him back down, grounding him with weight and warmth. "It's not mortar fire," Ethan muttered through clenched teeth. The drilling continued in the distance, steady and rhythmic. Shadow stayed pressed against him until the sound faded. By morning, exhaustion had carved lines beneath Ethan's eyes. He stepped onto the porch and watched frost glisten across the valley, while black Elk Ridge stood silent as ever, its western corridor catching the first light. The sound came again around noon. Ethan flinched without meaning to. Shadow noticed. The dog rose carefully and walked to the door, as if standing guard against an enemy that existed only in memory. Ethan crouched beside him. "They're just machines," he said quietly, but his voice lacked certainty. The drilling didn't stop, and neither did the letters. Western Frontier requested survey access again, and offered an increased purchase price, added a note about potential public utility designation. Claire advised patience. "They're building pressure," she said. "They want you to react emotionally." Ethan let out a humorless breath. Too late for that. That evening, he drove up to the ridge alone for the first time since Shadow's injury. The snow made the climb slower. He left the truck lower on the slope and walked the rest of the way, boots crunching through frozen crust. But at the western corridor, he stood still and listened. Wind moved clean across the pass. No drilling here, no machinery, just open air and stone. He closed his eyes briefly. The desert flashed behind them. Dust clouds, distant concussions, the smell of burned metal. His pulse spiked before he forced it down. "Not there," he whispered. He opened his eyes again and focused on the present. Black Elk Ridge was solid beneath his boots. He walked the corridor slowly, measuring width with his steps, checking the firmness of ground. He imagined pipeline segments laid carefully through the pass, imagined heavy equipment climbing without needing to blast through rock. Walter had known, and now Western Frontier knew. When Ethan returned to the cabin, Shadow greeted him at the door, tail wagging carefully but determinedly. "You should have been there," Ethan told him. The dog leaned against his leg. That night, the drilling sound carried louder than before. Ethan sat at the table with Walter's notebooks open, studying the cross-sections again. He traced the lines showing water flow beneath the western shelf. Water rights in Montana were more valuable than most people realized. Claire had said that too. He looked at the legal draft she'd emailed earlier. 30-year corridor lease. 65% mineral ownership retained. Full water basin control. Environmental protections with severe penalties. He imagined Frank Holloway's face reading those terms. The drilling stopped suddenly sometime after midnight. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Ethan sat upright in bed again, heart racing. Shadow lifted his head immediately. Outside, an engine idled briefly near the road before fading. No headlights reached the cabin. No footsteps followed. Just silence. Ethan lay back down slowly. "Stay with me," he whispered. Shadow rested his chin across Ethan's chest, feeling the rise and fall of breath. Morning came gray and brittle. The second official letter arrived with a courier this time. Western Frontier formally disputed the clarity of Walter's mineral filings, claimed incomplete survey data, suggested a joint verification process. "They're trying to weaken your documentation," Claire said over speakerphone as Ethan stood beside the stove. "Can they?" "No," she replied firmly. "Not legally, but they can drag it out." Ethan glanced at Shadow, who was now walking more steadily, but still favoring his shoulder. "How long?" he asked. "As long as you let them." The drilling started again that afternoon, closer this time. Ethan stepped outside and listened carefully. The sound no longer startled him. It irritated him. There was a difference. Shadow stood beside him, eyes fixed on the ridge. The dog's ears twitched once, then settled. "They're pushing," Ethan said quietly. Shadow gave a single sharp bark. Not alarm. Agreement. But Ethan looked at the ridge. "They think pressure makes men fold." He reached down and rested his hand on Shadow's back. "They're wrong." But as the sun dropped behind the mountains and the valley darkened once more, Ethan felt the truth settle in deeper. This fight wouldn't be won with strength alone. It would be won with endurance. And endurance, he knew better than most, left scars. Shadow leaned against him as the drilling continued in the distance. For the first time since the church laughter, Ethan realized something else. The ridge wasn't just waiting, it was testing him, and the test had only begun. 2 weeks after the night of the gunshot, Claire called with a different tone in her voice. "Ethan," she said, "I need you to come to Helena. Bring every original notebook your grandfather left you." There was something in the way she said it, controlled but sharpened. Ethan packed the cedar-bound journals carefully into a canvas bag. Shadow insisted on coming, even though Dr. Lawson had recommended another week of limited movement. The bandage was gone now. A thin line of healing scar traced along his shoulder. "You're stubborn," Ethan told him as the dog climbed into the truck. Shadow's tail thumped once. The drive to Helena felt longer than usual. Snow had melted into dark streaks along the highway. Mountains rose on both sides, ancient and indifferent. Claire was waiting when they arrived. At her office table was covered with printed geological reports and satellite images. "You weren't exaggerating," she said, as Ethan laid Walter's notebooks out before her. She opened one carefully, almost reverently. "Look at this," she continued, sliding a document toward him. It was a recent federal mineral survey map. The highlighted section overlapped almost perfectly with the northern half of Black Elk Ridge. Lithium concentrations here are some of the highest in western Montana," Claire said. "And the tech industry is in a race to secure domestic supply." Ethan stared at the paper. Walter's handwritten notes lined up with the official government mapping decades later. "He knew," Ethan murmured. Claire nodded. "And that's not all." She pulled another file from beneath the stack. "Water basin records. Your grandfather filed preliminary flow measurements in the late 70s. Well, he never fully registered the claim." "Why not?" Claire looked up at him. "Because once you register a full basin, you attract attention." Ethan felt the weight of that. Walter hadn't ignored the water. He had protected it. Claire continued. "Western Frontier recently expanded their scope. They're not just looking at pipeline routing. They're preparing for potential mineral extraction partnerships." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They don't want a corridor," he said slowly. They want the whole ridge." "Yes," Claire leaned back. "And here's the part they didn't expect. Your grandfather's filings are legally sound, incomplete in presentation, perhaps, but valid." She slid a final sheet across the table, an internal memo from Western Frontier, obtained through a public records request. Subject, "Brooks Parcel Strategic Risk," it read. Ethan scanned the lines. "Phew, Control of Brooks' parcel critical to long-term extraction viability. Owner unwilling to negotiate full sale. Public relations sensitivity due to veteran status. He stopped reading. They're worried, he said. They are. Ethan looked at Shadow, who lay quietly beside the desk, watching both of them with steady eyes. They fired at my dog because they thought I'd scare easy. Claire folded her hands. They miscalculated. Silence settled between them. Outside, Mount Helena traffic moved steadily below the window. Inside, the air felt charged. Claire leaned forward slightly. You need to understand something. Once we file a formal assertion of water rights and mineral dominance, this becomes public record. It will make headlines locally. They'll try to frame you as obstructionist, anti-growth. Ethan thought about Silver Creek, about the general store, about Frank's smirk turning into resentment. They already don't like me much, he said, and Claire gave a faint smile. They don't have to like you. They have to respect your contract. Ethan stood and walked to the window. Helena's skyline wasn't much. Brick buildings, courthouse dome, distant hills, but it felt far removed from the quiet valley where Black Elk Ridge cut across the horizon. My grandfather waited 30 years, he said quietly. Yes. For the right moment. Claire joined him at the window, and that moment might be now. He turned back to the table and picked up one of Walter's notebooks. In the margin of a page near the western pass, his grandfather had written a single line. Timing determines value. Ethan closed the notebook slowly. What's our next move, Tasso? He asked. We send them terms, Claire replied. Not defensive, not reactive, strategic. She began outlining it. 30-year renewable lease for corridor access, 65% retained mineral ownership, and strict environmental clauses, full water basin registration under Brooks Trust, profit-sharing thresholds tied to production volume. And if they refuse, Ethan asked, then they can try to build around you. They both knew what that meant. Impossible grading costs, geological instability, investor pushback. Western Frontier could afford stubbornness, but not inefficiency. Ethan knelt beside Shadow and ran his hand along the dog's back. You ready for more visitors? He asked softly, when Shadow's ears lifted. That evening, as Ethan and Shadow drove back toward Silver Creek, the sky over Black Elk Ridge burned orange beneath the setting sun. From the highway, Ethan could see drilling equipment parked idle on the southern slope, for now. When they reached the cabin, 2 pickup trucks were parked near the gate. Frank Holloway stood beside them, and Daniel Reeves. They were waiting. Shadow stiffened immediately. Ethan stepped out of the truck slowly. Wish Frank didn't smile this time. We heard you went to Helena, he said. Ethan closed the truck door carefully. I did. Reeves stepped forward, his tone measured but sharper than before. We're prepared to revise our offer. I'm not selling, Ethan replied calmly. Reeves glanced toward the ridge. You're escalating this unnecessarily. No, Ethan said evenly. You did. Wind swept across the yard, cold and steady. Frank's gaze flicked briefly toward Shadow's scarred shoulder. Oh, that dog got lucky, he muttered. Shadow's low growl vibrated through the air. Ethan stepped forward just enough to make his position unmistakable. He didn't get lucky, he said quietly. He did his job. Silence. Reeves exhaled slowly. What are your terms? He asked. Ethan met his eyes. You'll have them in writing. The ridge loomed behind them in fading light. The laughter from the church felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Now there was no humor left. Only calculation. As the trucks pulled away and the dust settled, Ethan stood beside Shadow and watched the last of the sunlight slip off the stone face of Black Elk Ridge. His grandfather had waited. He had mapped. He had prepared. And now the ridge was no longer waiting alone. Ethan felt something steady rise inside him. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. The next move would not belong to Western Frontier. It would belong to him. Ethan didn't wait. The following morning, when Claire filed the formal assertion of mineral dominance and water basin registration with the state. By noon, it was public record. By sunset, Silver Creek was buzzing. The first headline appeared on the local Helena news site. Veteran claims major lithium deposit in Silver Creek Ridge dispute. By the next morning, a regional outlet picked it up. Then a national energy blog. They mentioned Black Elk Ridge. They mentioned Western Frontier. They mentioned the word strategic more than once. Oh, and they mentioned Ethan Brooks, U.S. Army veteran. The drilling on the southern slope stopped. Completely. Ethan stood on his porch that afternoon, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the ridge. Silence. The kind that comes before a storm, or after one. Shadow sat beside him, shoulder fully healed now, scar faint but permanent. The dog's posture was relaxed for the first time in weeks, but his ears still tracked every passing vehicle. A pickup slowed at the gate. Ethan didn't move. Frank Holloway stepped out alone this time. No mayor. No Reeves. Just Frank. He removed his hat before walking up the drive. That alone said something. Ethan stayed where he was. Shadow rose slowly, but did not growl. Frank stopped a few feet short of the porch. "I read the papers," he said. Ethan nodded once. Frank looked older than he had at the church, not physically, but in posture, in weight. "Lithium," Frank muttered, "and a water basin." Ethan didn't answer. As Frank looked up at the ridge, then back at Ethan. "You knew." "My grandfather did." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "That corridor, that's the only stable route, isn't it?" "Yes." Frank ran a hand over his face. "Reeves told us it might cost triple to go around you. Investors are asking questions now." "Sounds expensive," Ethan said evenly. Frank glanced at Shadow's scar. "I didn't know about the men that night," he said quietly. Ethan studied him. "I didn't send anyone." Silence stretched. Ethan didn't know whether to believe him. It didn't matter anymore. "What do you want, Frank?" he asked. Frank hesitated. "They're panicking," he admitted. "Western Frontier's board didn't expect this to go public. They thought they could box you in quiet." Ethan leaned back slightly against the porch rail. "They miscalculated." Frank gave a short, humorless laugh. "They sure did." He looked up at Ethan directly. "Well, you planning to squeeze them dry?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "No." Frank blinked. "No?" "I'm planning to lease access, protect the water, protect the land, and make sure Silver Creek benefits." Frank studied him carefully. "You could walk away rich." "I will," Ethan replied calmly. "Without selling." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Frank let out a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." Ethan waited. "I laughed," Frank said. "At the church. I thought Walter was being sentimental." "He wasn't," Ethan replied. Frank nodded slowly. "Guess I misjudged both of you." Shadow stepped closer to Ethan's side but remained quiet. Frank looked down at the dog. "He saved you," he said. "He always does." Another silence. But this one felt different. Not hostile. Not tense, just honest. Frank replaced his hat. "Oh, if you're serious about keeping this local, about helping the town, you'll have support." Ethan looked toward the valley. Silver Creek's water lines were aging. The volunteer fire department struggled for funding. The veteran support network was almost non-existent. He turned back to Frank. "I don't want charity," he said. "I want fair contracts." Frank gave a single nod. "Fair's better than nothing." When Frank drove away, he didn't look back. The next visitor came that evening, Reeves. This time, he didn't arrive in a black SUV. He drove alone in a standard company truck. He didn't step forward aggressively. He didn't smile. "I underestimated you," he said plainly. Ethan remained standing at the edge of the porch. "Yes," he replied. Reeves looked toward Black Elk Ridge. "Our board has reviewed your filings. They're valid." Shadow's tail flicked once. "We're prepared to negotiate lease terms." Ethan held his gaze. 30 years, renewable, and 65% retained mineral ownership, full water basin control, environmental safeguards. Reeves nodded slowly. "You drive a hard bargain." "I drive a fair one." Reeves exhaled. "Your terms will cost us. So will blasting around me." The wind cut sharply between them. Reeves gave the smallest hint of a smile. "You're your grandfather's grandson." Ethan didn't answer. After a long pause, Reeves extended his hand again. This time, Ethan took it. The handshake was firm. Measured. Not friendship. Agreement. As Reeves drove away, the sky over Black Elk Ridge turned deep violet. The drilling equipment remained still. For the first time since the laughter in the church, Ethan felt the ground shift. Not beneath his feet, but in the town's perception. Silver Creek no longer saw him as the quiet veteran who inherited rocks. They saw leverage. Inside the cabin, Ethan unfolded Walter's notebook one more time. On the final page, near the margin, one his grandfather had written, "Let them believe what they want. The land will speak in time." Ethan closed the book gently. Outside, Shadow lay at the doorway, watching the ridge as he had since the beginning. The laughter had vanished. In its place stood something stronger. Respect. For a while, things felt steady. Negotiations moved forward in clean, controlled steps. Claire handled the drafting. Western Frontier's legal team responded with revisions that were sharp, but no longer threatening. The drilling crews stayed off Black Elk Ridge. The corridor remained untouched. Silver Creek changed its tone. Men who once crossed the street without nodding now tipped their hats. The general store clerk asked about Shadow's shoulder with genuine concern. Even the mayor spoke carefully when Ethan walked into a room. But pressure doesn't vanish. It shifts. 3 weeks into formal negotiations, Ethan noticed Shadow slowing again. At first it was subtle. The dog rose more slowly from the floor. He hesitated before jumping into the truck. He licked at his old wound longer than usual. "You overdid it," Ethan muttered one evening as Shadow settled near the stove. The scar looked healed, but by morning, the dog's shoulder was swollen. Ethan crouched beside him, hand resting lightly along the muscle. Shadow didn't flinch. That worried him more. They drove straight to Dr. Lawson. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and warm hay. Sunlight streamed through the window in pale stripes across the exam table. Dr. Lawson ran careful hands along the old injury. "Sometimes grazing wounds hide deeper trauma," she said quietly. "Infection can settle in scar tissue." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't show it. "He wouldn't," she replied. An X-ray confirmed it. A small fragment, barely visible, had remained lodged near the muscle. Not life-threatening, but painful. "Oh, we can remove it," she said. "Surgery's routine, but he'll need time to recover." "How long?" "A few weeks at least." Ethan nodded slowly. The contract signing in Denver was scheduled in 5 days. Claire had insisted his presence would solidify terms. Western Frontier's board wanted the optics. Veteran landowner shaking hands. Public narrative repaired. Dr. Lawson placed a hand lightly on Ethan's arm. "He'll be fine," she said. "She won't. But he'll need you when he wakes up." The choice wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with music or thunder. It arrived quietly, like most important decisions do. Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog's amber eyes never wavered. "I'll be here," Ethan said. He called Claire from the parking lot. "You can sign without me," he told her. There was a pause. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes. Western Frontier won't like that." "I don't care." He glanced through the clinic window. A shadow lay on the table, calm and steady. "He stood for me," Ethan said quietly. "I stand for him." Claire exhaled softly. "I'll handle it." The surgery lasted 2 hours. Ethan sat alone in the waiting room, hands folded, staring at the floorboards. The hum of fluorescent lights reminded him too much of military hospital corridors. He forced his breathing steady. When Dr. Lawson finally stepped out, her face was calm. "He's going to be fine." Relief didn't come in a rush, but it came in slow, controlled release. Ethan entered the recovery room quietly. Shadow lay wrapped in blankets, eyes half closed but alert at the sound of Ethan's boots. The dog tried to lift his head. "Easy," Ethan whispered. Shadow's tail thumped once against the metal table. Later that evening, while Ethan sat beside the kennel at home, his phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "It's done." Attached was a photo. A conference table in Denver. Reeves shaking Claire's hand. No document signed. Ethan studied the image carefully. 30-year lease. 65% retained mineral ownership. Full water basin protection. Environmental clauses intact. They hadn't cut a single major term. He set the phone down and looked at Shadow. "We did it," he murmured. The dog's breathing was slow but steady. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and quiet across the valley. The next morning, local news stations reported the agreement. Chum Veteran secures landmark energy deal in Silver Creek. They framed it as a win-win. Economic growth without land loss. Jobs without forced sale. The tone had changed completely. But Ethan didn't leave the cabin that day. Or the next. He stayed beside Shadow as the dog healed. He changed bandages carefully, measured antibiotics, sat quietly during long stretches of recovery when Shadow slept, but never fully relaxed. On the third evening, Shadow managed to stand and walk slowly to the door. He sat there, watching black Elk Ridge through the falling snow, still guarding. Ethan knelt beside him. "You don't have to prove anything," he said softly. Shadow leaned into his hand. The contract meant money would begin flowing within months. Mineral surveys would start under controlled supervision. Water basin infrastructure upgrades would be funded by Western Frontier's lease payments. Silver Creek would benefit. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was the steady warmth of the dog beside him. The one who had stepped between him and danger without hesitation. The one who had taken the hit. Ethan looked toward the ridge. It no longer felt like a test. It felt like responsibility. The cost hadn't been land. It had been loyalty. And loyalty, he knew better than most, was never negotiable. Shadow rested his chin on the wooden threshold, eyes fixed on the horizon. Still standing guard, even when he didn't have to. Spring came slowly to Silver Creek. Snow retreated in uneven patches across the valley floor. Meltwater cut thin silver veins through the low fields. Black Elk Ridge shed its winter coat in stages, revealing the pale stone beneath like bone beneath skin. Shadow healed with the season. The stiffness in his shoulder eased day by day. The scar remained, faint but permanent, a pale reminder beneath thick fur. He no longer limped, and he no longer hesitated before climbing into the truck. But he moved with a little more caution now. Older, wiser. Ethan noticed. He moved with more caution, too. The lease agreement activated in early April. Western Frontier crews arrived under strict supervision. No blasting, no deviation from the corridor line. Survey flags marked the Western Pass precisely where Walter's notes had indicated decades earlier. Engineers worked quietly, aware now that they were guests, not owners. Ethan stood on the ridge during the first controlled grading pass. He wore work gloves and a heavy jacket, watching as equipment rolled through the natural corridor without needing to tear the mountain open. The grade held exactly as Walter had measured. The soil compacted cleanly. No slide, no fracture. Daniel Reeves approached him mid-morning. "You were right about the stability," Reeves admitted. "My grandfather was," Ethan corrected. Reeves nodded. "No, production modeling has shifted," he added. "The lithium reserve estimates are higher than initial projections." Ethan didn't react. "That's good for both of us," Reeves continued. "It's good for the town," Ethan said. Reeves studied him. "You could have sold." "Yes." "And left." "Yes." "But you didn't." Ethan looked across the valley toward Silver Creek. Leaving wasn't the point. Reeves didn't respond. He didn't need to. By summer, the water basin project began. When under the lease agreement, Western Frontier funded the installation of a new pumping station drawing from the registered basin beneath the ridge. Clean, steady groundwater replaced the aging well system that had served Silver Creek for decades. The first time the upgraded system activated, the whole town gathered near the old water tower. Children ran through the grass. Ranchers stood with folded arms, watching skeptically. The mayor gave a short speech about infrastructure and resilience, yet Ethan stayed near the edge of the crowd. Shadow sat at his side, calm and watchful. When the pumps kicked in, a low hum moved through the ground. The tower filled steadily. Clear water flowed through pipes that hadn't seen proper pressure in years. A cheer rose from the crowd. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. Frank Holloway stepped up beside Ethan. "Never thought that ridge would give us drinking water," he said quietly. "It always did," Ethan replied. "Yeah, we just didn't know how to listen." Frank nodded once. Later that month, Ethan attended the first meeting of the newly established Silver Creek Veterans Outreach Center. The funding had come directly from his share of the initial lease payments. A small brick building near Main Street had been renovated. Folding chairs lined the walls. Coffee brewed in a large stainless steel pot near the window. 6 veterans showed up the first night. Men in their 50s, one in his 70s, and one younger than Ethan, with hands that trembled slightly when he reached for a cup. They didn't talk much at first. They didn't need to. Ethan didn't give a speech. He just sat down. Shadow lay at his feet. Halfway through the meeting, the younger man's breathing tightened at the sound of a truck backfiring outside. Shadow lifted his head immediately. Ethan saw it. The distant look in the man's eyes. The shift. He leaned forward slightly. "You're here," Ethan said quietly. "Oh, you're safe." Shadow stood and moved closer to the man, resting his head gently against his knee. The trembling slowed. No applause followed. No dramatic moment. Just steady presence. After the meeting, the older veteran approached Ethan. "Didn't think anyone around here understood," he said. Ethan looked down at Shadow. "Some of us do." By late August, the corridor through Black Elk Ridge was complete. The first test line was laid cleanly across the pass, while Western Frontier engineers inspected it with careful efficiency. No blasting. No forced cuts. The mountain remained intact, except for the narrow, precise path it had always allowed. Ethan stood on the ridge at sunset that evening. The pipeline glinted faintly in the fading light. Below, Silver Creek's water tower reflected gold against the sky. Shadow sat beside him, ears twitching at distant sounds of work crews packing up equipment. The valley felt different now, not conquered, not consumed, balanced. Ethan knelt and placed his hand against the ground. He could almost feel the steady coolness beneath it, the basin Walter had mapped, the water that had waited patiently under stone for someone to protect it. Shadow shifted closer. "You did good," Ethan said softly. The dog's tail brushed lightly against the gravel. A truck approached slowly up the ridge road. Claire stepped out, smiling faintly. "It's official," she said. "All filings recorded. Royalty schedules locked in. Environmental protections permanent." Ethan stood. "No appeals?" "None." She looked across the ridge. "Your grandfather would have liked this." Ethan didn't answer immediately. "He would have told me to keep watching," he said finally. Claire smiled. "That too." As night fell over Black Elk Ridge, the first operational test run sent a low, steady vibration through the corridor. Not violent, not invasive, just movement. The mountain accepted it without complaint. Ethan stood in silence as the line activated. He had fought. He had negotiated. He had waited. And now the ridge no longer tested him. It stood with him. Shadow leaned against his leg, steady and warm. Below them, Silver Creek's lights flickered on one by one. The town had water. It had revenue. It had something it hadn't had before. Hope. Ethan turned toward home as darkness settled across the valley. The battle had ended quietly, but the legacy was just beginning. Years passed the way they do in mountain towns, without announcement, without spectacle. Black Elk Ridge became part of the landscape in a new way. Not just as a jagged silhouette against the sky, but as a steady contributor to Silver Creek's survival. The corridor of Jar carried its line without incident. The lithium extraction sites operated under tight regulation, small and controlled, exactly as the contract demanded. No blasting scarred the horizon. No water turned cloudy. The basin flowed clean. Silver Creek changed slowly. The volunteer fire department replaced its aging engine. The elementary school roof stopped leaking. The Veterans Outreach Center expanded into the building next door. And every month, the royalty statement arrived in Ethan's mailbox. Thick envelope, precise numbers, steady growth. He never opened them with excitement. He opened them with responsibility. Shadow grew older. It happened in increments, and a grayness at the muzzle, a stiffness after long walks, a slower rise from the floor in the mornings. But he never stopped watching the door, even when no one came anymore. Even when Western Frontier had become a predictable partner instead of a threat. Even when Silver Creek treated Ethan not with suspicion or curiosity, but with respect that had settled deep and steady. One October evening, Ethan sat on the porch facing Black Elk Ridge. The air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Leaves had begun turning gold along the valley floor. Shadow lay at his feet, head resting on his paws. The dog no longer tracked every distant truck. His hearing had dulled slightly. His eyes clouded faintly at the edges. But when Ethan shifted in his chair, Shadow still looked up, still checking. "You don't have to guard everything," Ethan said quietly. Shadow blinked, tail brushing once against the boards. Down the slope, just a new sound carried faintly from town. Laughter. Different from the church laughter years ago. This was lighter. Children running near the water tower. Veterans gathering for coffee. A community that had found footing. Ethan stood slowly and walked down the porch steps toward the truck. "Come on," he said gently. Shadow rose carefully and followed. They drove up the ridge road one more time before winter set in. The pass looked almost unchanged, and the corridor blended into the land as if it had always been there. The line ran quiet beneath protective casing, humming only faintly. Ethan parked and stepped out. The wind was mild that evening. Shadow walked beside him to the highest point overlooking the valley. They stood there together. Walter's old measurement stakes were long gone, but Ethan could still trace the memory of them in his mind. He knelt and pressed his palm against the ground. Cool, steady, patient. Timing determines value, he murmured, recalling the note in the margin of his grandfather's journal. Shadow moved closer and leaned into his leg. The dog's breathing was slower now, heavier. That winter came harder than the last. Snow fell thick and fast across Silver Creek. Roads closed for days at a time. The ridge disappeared beneath white drifts. Shadow slept more often. One evening, as snow pressed quietly against the cabin windows, Ethan sat beside the stove with Walter's cedar chest open before him. Inside lay every notebook, every map, every contract copy. He added something new, a leather-bound folder containing the finalized lease agreement, the water basin protections, and the charter for the Silver Creek Veterans Outreach Center. He placed it carefully beside Walter's original journals. Not just land, he said softly. Legacy. Behind him, Shadow stirred. Ethan turned. The dog struggled briefly to stand. Back down. Ethan moved quickly to his side. I'm here, he said. Shadow's eyes, still amber despite their age, met his. There was no fear in them, no confusion, just recognition. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge in long, low currents. Ethan rested his hand against Shadow's chest, feeling the slow rise and fall. You did your job, he whispered. The breathing grew shallower, slower. Ethan stayed with him. He did not rush the moment, but he did not turn away. When Shadow finally went still, it was quiet. No dramatic sound, no sudden movement. Just the steady end of a long watch. The snow outside continued falling. Ethan sat there for a long time. Then he rose and wrapped the dog carefully in a wool blanket. At first light, he carried Shadow up the ridge. The path was harder now with snow underfoot, but Ethan climbed steadily. He reached the western corridor and moved beyond it to a cedar tree near the basin's edge. When he dug carefully, slowly, deliberately. When it was done, he placed Shadow beneath the tree that overlooked both the corridor and the water basin, still guarding, still watching. Spring returned again, as it always does. The ridge shed its snow. The basin flowed. One afternoon, months later, Ethan drove into town and stopped by the animal shelter. He hadn't planned to. But when he stepped inside, a small gray German Shepherd pup looked up at him through the kennel bars. Amber eyes, curious, uncertain. Ethan crouched slowly. The pup tilted her head. You don't know what you're signing up for, he murmured. The tail wagged cautiously. He brought her home. The first night, she wandered the cabin unsure, nose low to the floor. Then she found the doorway. She sat there instinctively, looking out at the ridge. Ethan watched her from the kitchen. The cedar chest sat open on the table. Walter's journals, Ethan's contracts, the legacy of patience. While he walked to the doorway and knelt beside the pup. Grandpa didn't leave me land, he said quietly. He left me the patience to wait. The pup leaned against his leg. Outside, black Elk Ridge stood unchanged against the Montana sky. Not empty, not conquered, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt no pressure in his chest, no distant echoes, just wind moving clean across stone. The last one had stood guard, and now another would learn. If this story meant something to you, if you believe loyalty still matters, if you believe patience can outlast power, I'd like to hear from you. Just comment the number 1 if you think Shadow was more than a dog. Comment 0 if you believe patience is the real strength in this world. That's it. Simple. And if you want more stories about courage, quiet strength, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't break, make sure you subscribe. There are more ridges waiting, more stories standing guard. And I'll see you in the next one.